In this video, we will show you how to replace your engine knock sensor. Let's get started. We're going to be removing the intake from the engine. Make sure you have a set of intake gaskets for this job. Okay friends, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to mention is you want to make sure you're wearing hand and eye protection at all times. You also need to get safely underneath the front of the vehicle, so make sure you're in an area that you can get underneath. Before we do that, let's make our way right over to the right front of the vehicle. You're going to find a fuse box. Let's go ahead and lift this up. Once you've done that, you want to remove this yellow fuse. It's a 20 amp fuse for the fuel pump. Once it's out of there, just give it a quick inspection. Make sure it is still reusable. Replace it as necessary. We'll set this aside. The next thing you want to do is try to start the vehicle. You might notice it starts, but then dies right out, or it doesn't start at all. That's a good sign. Reinstall your 20 amp fuse. Close the fuse box. Disconnect your negative battery terminal using an 8mm wrench. Set that aside so it's making no contact with the battery. Carefully open up your radiator coolant overflow tank. Lift this up and away from your face, give it a quick inspection, and set it aside. Now let's make our way under the front of the vehicle with a collection receptacle. Find the drain on the bottom of the radiator. Go ahead and start draining that coolant. Once it's done draining, cap it off. Now that we're down to a steady trickle, we'll just go ahead and close this. Make sure that's snug. Clean your mess. Make your way back up into the engine compartment. Remove your plastic cover along the top using a 1/4 inch drive square socket. Set that aside. Now let's follow the air inlet tube to where it connects onto the throttle body. Use an 8mm socket or flathead screwdriver to loosen this clamp just enough that you can slide it off of here. Once you have that off of there, continue on to your breather hose. For this, where my thumb is, you can see that there's a green tab. Gently pull this away from the air inlet and slide the hose off. Make your way down towards where the air filter box is. You'll find another 8mm headed clamp. Loosen that one as well. Now we can slide this off of here. Quick inspection, set it aside. Continue on to disconnecting all of your fuel injectors. You'll find that you have 4 of them on each side of the engine. That's the little gray connectors right along here. Squeeze on that tab, pull this off. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, just take a peek for corrosion. Assuming it looks good, set it aside. Now I'll do the same on the other side of the vehicle. Once you've removed all 8 of your connectors, continue on to your ignition coils. For these, you're going to go ahead and dislodge each of the electrical connectors, give it a quick check for corrosion, and then set that aside. Once you have all of them disconnected, you're also going to remove the ignition coil from the area. Let's make our way down the line, removing each of the ignition coils. To do this, you'll find that you have one 7mm headed bolt holding each of them in place. As you remove these, you need to make sure that you mark them in a way so you know exactly where each one goes for the installation process. Once it's out of there, I'll just give this a quick check. I want to make sure the boot doesn't look torn, worn, or damaged in any way. If it does, now's a good time to replace it. Aside from that, I'll continue on by taking a crayon and I'm going to mark this one. I'll put one line on the forward one, 2 lines on the next one back, and make my way down the line. Set all these aside on one side of the vehicle and do the exact same thing on the other side. Let's continue on to removing some electrical connectors. Come right over to the alternator. On the back side of this connector, you'll find a squeeze tab. You can squeeze that in and lift this up and off. Quick check for corrosion. We'll remove this mounting point. You can use a trim tool for this. Come right over here. On this, you're going to find that you have a red locking tab. I'll carefully pull that away. Right in that same area, there's a squeeze tab. Go ahead and squeeze that and pull this off. Make your way to the back side of the throttle body. We'll disconnect the throttle position sensor. On this, there's a red locking tab. Go ahead and slide that away and press in on the tab to remove this. Let's make our way right along here. You're going to find the brake booster hose. For this, squeeze the clamp, slide the hose off, give it a quick inspection, and set it aside. Let's move along to this line. On this line, you'll find that you have a yellow connector. You can go ahead and press in that push tab and then slide this off. Give that a quick inspection and set that aside as well. Move along to your EGR valve. You'll have an electrical connector with a push tab up along the top. Squeeze that in and disconnect it. Let's continue on to this area. You're going to find that you have a rubber boot that goes to your fuel line pressure sensor. Go ahead and slide this right off of here. Make sure it's soft and pliable. Continue on to this area. We have this green tab. Go ahead and slide that over and pull this off. Continue on to removing the bracket that covers your EGR tube. For this, you'll find that you have 2 10mm headed bolts holding this in place. Remove the pair and the bracket. Next, you will use an 1 1/16" wrench to remove the EGR tube from the EGR valve. Once you've got movement from this area, continue on. Now let's start removing this from the top of the intake. You'll find that you have 4 8mm headed bolts holding this in place. There's one here, one right over here, and then the other 2 are located right behind it, directly behind the forward bolts. Once you have all 4 of those broken free, continue on to this one last 8mm headed bolt. Go ahead and remove this. The next thing you will want to do is make sure you cover this hole so no miscellaneous debris can make its way in. I'll just use this pad and carefully place it in here. Let's disconnect this electrical connector. Now let's move along to the top of the alternator. Remove the protected boot. Underneath that, you'll find a 13mm headed nut holding this wire in place. Go ahead and remove that nut. set that aside. You can grab that wire, lift it up and off of there, and now we'll continue on with a trim tool and carefully pull this off of here. Now we can move along to removing the serpentine belt. Before you do that, have a look down inside this area. You'll find that the belt goes over some pulleys and under others. Take note of the routing. Once you've done that, continue on with a 3/8 drive ratchet or a serpentine belt tool. You'll be looking for the serpentine belt tensioner down in this area. Find the slot that has the area for the ratchet, slide it in position, turn this clockwise. Once you've done that, you can take the belt off of the alternator. Move along to removing your two 10mm headed bolts that hold your alternator bracket to the intake. Continue on to loosening your two 13mm headed bolts that hold the alternator to the engine. They only need to be loose enough that you can lift this up and away. Set your alternator aside. Let's make our way back here on the passenger side of the engine. We're going to have to remove this bracket. You'll find on the bracket there's an area where there's a wiring harness pressed into it. Use a small prying device and pop that out of position. There we are. With this broken free, we can continue on removing this bracket. For this, you'll find that you have two mounting bolts. There's a 15mm up here and a second one down behind this area. Now this one's a little bit harder to see. I put a mirror down there so you can have a look. I'll go ahead and get it right out of there. Now we can continue on to our second bolt right up top. For this bolt, you'll find that it goes straight down through this bracket, directly down through the intake into the engine. Go ahead and slide this up and out of here. Quick inspection. Let's grab that bracket and remove it from the engine. There it is. Let's move along to the thermostat housing. For this, you'll find two 10mm bolts holding it down. Keep in mind, there could still potentially be a little bit of coolant left in this area. Lift this up and off of here and set it aside. Let's make our way to the other side of the intake. You're going to want to dislodge the wiring harness from this side as well. There should be a little connector down here with a push tab. Go ahead and pop that right out of there. Now we can start removing the heater core hose from the top of the intake. Squeeze the two ears on the clamp, slide the clamp up the hose, and remove the hose from the intake. At this point, we're going to continue on to removing the fuel line from the fuel rail. It's important to note there could be fuel inside of this area still. To remove this, make your way underneath these two ears and lift the locking clip out of position. With that out of the way, looking inside of this area, you're going to find that you have a spring clip. You're going to want to use a tool that can fit right over this tube and slide up against that spring, separating it so we can slide this out of position. Set this aside. Let's continue removing our mounting bolts that hold the intake to the engine. Along the passenger side, you'll find 5 10mm headed bolts that hold it down over here, and then we'll move over to the driver's side to continue. On the driver's side, there's only 3 more mounting bolts left. The next thing that we will do is carefully start lifting this up and out of position. You'll find that you have to come up diagonally, lifting up the forward aspect up and out of here. The back end has to stay a little low because you do still have the EGR tube in the way. Let's remove our intake gaskets from the engine. There we are. With your intake out of the way, you have clear access to your NOx sensor. Use a 10mm to remove the mounting bolt. Carefully lift up on the NOx sensor. Now we can start pulling it out of this belly of the engine. Come right along here. You'll find the electrical connector. There it is, friends. All right, friends, let's get ready to install our brand new engine NOx sensor. Take the NOx sensor with the mounting bolt and put it in position in the engine. Once you have it started in by hand, go ahead and bottom this out and then torque it to 177 inch-pounds. Continue on by taking the wiring underneath this hose, bring it underneath this wiring harness, and bring it all the way over to its original position. Connect in your NOx sensor. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's completely secured. Reattach it to the wiring harness. Now it's time to prepare the engine for installation of the intake. You'll find all up along the top of the engine where the intake gasket was, generally there's going to be some corrosion in these areas. You need to make sure that this is a clean, flat, smooth surface. But while you're doing this, you need to also pay attention, making sure that no debris falls inside of any of these intake ports. Any of that will make its way into the engine and can potentially cause catastrophic damage. Use a clean rag and go ahead and cover each of these ports. Once you have each of your ports covered by something, continue on with a flat blade razor. We're going to clean the entire mating surface along the top of the engine where the intake gaskets ride. While we do this, be extremely careful not to brush things into the engine ports. Try to brush it away into the belly of the engine. Once you've done that, we'll continue on with a vacuum cleaner. Make sure we remove any debris that might have happened to have fallen inside of these ports and the belly of the engine. Once you've carefully scraped the entire top of the engine, continue on with a sanding block. You want to make sure that you have fine grit sandpaper. We're just going to go ahead and lightly skim this to make sure that it's a nice smooth surface. After that, we'll continue on by wiping this down and using a vacuum cleaner to make sure we clean each of these ports properly. After this side of the engine's done, you'd want to do the exact same thing to the other side. Now that I have this all scraped down, We'll continue on by using a vacuum and make sure we clean out each of these ports as well as possible. Continue on and do the exact same thing on the other side of the engine. Now that I have this side done, we'll continue on by cleaning out the belly of the engine. Over on the bench, we'll make our way over to the fuel rail. You want to make sure that you cover this port because there is still fuel in this area. I just have a rubber protective plug. I'll slide that right in position. Now we can turn this over to remove our gaskets. Now with this turned over, you want to look at the area that's supposed to go up against the engine. If you have the gasket still attached to the intake, remove that now. Obviously, it's a good idea to replace these gaskets whenever you're doing this job. I'll set this aside. Once the gasket's off of there, continue on to cleaning the area. You'll find that you have a lot of black carbon around the areas where the intake ports are. We'll be very careful, try to clean this out away from forcing things into any of the ports. Once you've finished cleaning one side of the intake, make sure you do the exact same thing to the other. Back over at the engine, we'll make sure that we remove the rags from each one of the ports going all the way down the line. Once you remove them, double check. It's important to make sure that you remove every single one of them. Even if you left one in here, you can cause some serious damage to the engine. Now we can install our intake gaskets. You'll find on one side of each of the gaskets, you have these areas that protrude outward. You want to make sure that you grab the proper one for the side of the engine you're working on. Looking along the side of the engine here, I can see that I have two holes for those little nubs to go into. We'll get this lined up. Before I press it all the way down, I just want to ensure that all of my holes line up perfectly down the line. Assuming this looks good, we'll just press it down into the engine and do the same on the other side. Let's continue on by installing our intake. As we push this in, be extremely careful not to damage any of your intake gaskets. Now we can start putting in our intake mounting bolts. We're only going to start these in by hand. Leave all of them loose for now. We'll put in all 5 on the passenger side, then make our way over to the driver's side. Let's move over to the driver's side. Let's temporarily put in our longer bolts as well. It's a good idea to start these in. That way there you know everything's lined up while we continue tightening the intake. Now we'll pause on bottoming out this last bolt right here. Let's continue by torquing these in the same sequence, starting from the center and making our way out. Torque these to 18 foot-pounds. Now we can remove this long bolt with the washer. Install our bracket, snug this up, and then we'll torque that last intake bolt. torque this to 18 foot-pounds as well. The next thing you will want to do is resecure the wiring harness to that bracket. Once we have it on this side, we'll move over to the other side and press it in over there as well. Reconnect your coolant hose to the top of the intake along the passenger side. Press that down as far as you can and release the clamp. Remove the plug from your fuel rail. Reconnect your fuel line. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's secured together, and then lock it in place. Make sure you can still pivot this breather hose underneath the fuel line. Remove each of those mounting bolts. Continue on with your thermostat housing. Let's slide this into place. Start in both of those mounting bolts. Snug these up and torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Let's put our alternator in place. Start in both of your upper mounting bolts. Once you have those started in, continue on down to your two lower mounting bolts. We'll snug those up and then torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Now we'll snug these and torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Get ready to install your serpentine belt. Put your belt in position. Make sure it's sitting over all the grooves on each of the pulleys as needed. If it's off by even one tooth, you're going to destroy the belt. Let's continue up here. Remove this. It's a good idea to remove, clean, and inspect the gasket. If it looks like it's torn or worn in any way, go ahead and replace it. Now we can install our throttle body spacer. Pay attention to the EGR tube, making sure that it slides into the EGR. Once we have it slid in there, we'll start it in by hand. After you get a couple threads on that, rest this in place. Continue on with your 5 8mm headed bolts. Start each of them in, snug them up, and then torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Let's make our way to that EGR tube and start snugging that down. All right there it's bottomed out. Just take it a little bit further to make sure it's snug. Let's start connecting this in. Go with the EGR valve. Listen for a click, give it a tug. Continue down here to the fuel rail pressure sensor. Let's get this on here. Swing this over, put it in position. Let's get our bracket back on here. Start in each of the mounting bolts, snug them up. Continue on to our two hoses. We'll slide that brake booster hose right on there. Put the clamp in the original position. Reconnect this line. Let's install our ignition coils, making sure that we reinstall them in the same position as when we had removed them. Slide that right down there onto the spark plug. Align your mounting bolt hole. Start in each of your mounting bolts, snug them up, and torque them to 53 inch-pounds. Let's continue on by plugging in the fuel injectors and the ignition coils going down the line. Listen for a click, give them a tug as you go. Now we can do the exact same thing on the other side of the vehicle. Reconnect your throttle position sensor. We'll press this in, listen for a click, and lock it in with the red locking tab. Time for the throttle body connector. Press it in, lock it down, give it a wiggle. Let's make our way over to the alternator. Press this in, got a click. Make sure that you secure that wiring. Inspect your alternator cable. If it looks like it has any funny colors on it, that's corrosion. You'd want to make sure you sand that down. Otherwise, let's go ahead and reconnect this to the alternator. Slide it right into place, start the nut on there, bottom it out, and then torque it to 106 inch-pounds. Make sure you put on your protective boot. Install your air inlet tube. Let's slide this in position on the throttle body. While it's pressed on there as far as you can, continue on by tightening your 8mm clamp. Make sure that's nice and tight. We'll follow it down to the other end. Tighten that clamp. Make your way up here to this hose. We'll slide that in position, making sure that it's secured. Double check all of this. It's important to make sure that no dirty or unmetered air makes its way into the engine. Reinstall your engine cover. You'll find along the backside, you have a couple notches, and you have that area on the alternator bracket with 2 tabs that protrude out. We'll get that lined up. Once you have that lined up, go ahead and roll this down. You should notice that the stud on the bracket on top of the engine sits directly inside this hole. Once it does, continue on with your nut, start it on there, and snug it up. Time to reconnect your negative battery terminal. Slide this all the way down onto the battery terminal as far as you can, and tighten that 8mm headed nut. Alright, at this point, it's time to start filling up the cooling system. Looking at the passenger side of your coolant reservoir, you're going to find the maximum line. We need to start filling this up. What you'll notice is as you're filling it, it's going to continue going down because it has to fill the cooling system. Once you get it up to this line, we're going to go ahead and start up the vehicle. Let it run for a little bit. Make sure you don't have a fuel leak or a coolant leak. Once you've burped out all the air from inside the system, make sure you put on your cap. After you've ran the vehicle for a while and it's up to normal running temperature, just double check that fluid. Assuming it's up to that maximum line, go ahead and put on your cap. Make sure that's nice and tight. At this point, go ahead and start up the car and take it for a road test. Aside from that, thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.